everybody, and welcome back to Writing the Rapids, the show where I, Joe Bielecki, talk to writers about writing. Very often, those writers have been recommended to me by writers who have previously been on the show, or it's a Rejoinder episode and they've been on the show already, and that's what this is. Never Angeline North is our guest again. She's the author of the books Sea Witch from Inside the Castle, Careful Mountain from CCM, Sarah, or The Existence of Fire from Horse Less Press, and Wolf Doctors from Artifice Books. She lives in beautiful Olympia, Washington with her girlfriend's boyfriend, their dog, a snake, and 2 rats. She is online at never.horse, and her new book is out through Apocalypse Party Press, and it's called Rainbear, with 9 exclamation points at the end. Before we get into our conversation with Never, I'd like to remind you that you can support this show financially through Patreon at patreon.com/noisemakerjoe. You can throw a one-time donation at me over at paypal.me/noisemakerjoe, or you can buy my book. It's called Tired. You can support the show for free by subscribing on the various podcatchers you use, giving it a 5-star rating if your podcatcher allows for ratings, and tweeting, retweeting, and posting about it on whatever social media you use now that Twitter is, well, you know. So without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Never. The thing that struck me about Rainbear, and that struck me about Sea Witch too, and I don't know if I really talked about it in a way that illustrated how I feel about it. In the sort of middle section of Rainbear, there's the 2 children, the son of the rabbi and the son of the fire king, who are talking, and the way that they talk to each other is like a way that I really like. Like, it's not, I don't know, it doesn't necessarily feel like supernatural, not supernatural like fantastical. It doesn't feel, particularly like the way that people talk in real life, but it kind of illustrates how people should talk to each other sometimes. It's just it's very 2020s, very are you prepared? Are you in a headspace to hear something that might be upsetting to you right now, sort of thing, but 2 people talking face to face.
Sure.
And it just strikes me as very loving. And there's scenes like that in Sea Witch too, where people talk to each other in that same manner. And I don't know if you talk to your friends like that in real life, and that's where you're pulling it from, or if it's like an aspirational something or other, but it's something that I find unique to your writing in my experience, and something that I really enjoy.
I think it's it comes from how I guess aspirational. Yeah. I think it comes from a place of like wouldn't it be great if every person had the care and the time and the energy to show such great respect for each other's humanity in how we interact with each other, and it comes from that the desire for the desire for myself to want to live in that world. And there are moments, I think, when I feel like I am able to be that person, or when other people have been able to be that person for me. And I think that's where I get that from. Also, for my job, I work as a facilitator of support groups for queer youth. And it is very, I think, especially that I'm not sure exactly what passages you're referencing, but the that kind of example you gave is very much something that comes to me, I think, through sort of it is sort of support groupies, especially for a facilitator in a support group, and it's and travels to me via I guess kind of radical mental health circles and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. And the first section of the book. So the book is in 3 sections, and it's like weaving storylines. But the first section is about a person who lives in a coffee shop who loves people, and that's their job. I'm very interested to know like where that comes from, like where you got the idea for that section of the book.
So I from sort of different places, that it felt like a median between 2 jobs that I've had. One job is my current job as a facilitator of support groups. The other job as a sex worker. And it's sort of the halfway point between those 2 jobs. And being someone who's had both of those jobs, it's like interesting to me how in our relationships, in romantic relationships, there's this kind of gray area between sex and love, and like the conflation of sex and love in all of these different ways that we get upside down, in all of these different ways, and that we get right, and it's not to say that there's no crossover there, because there definitely is crossover there, but it's also like, I think it's interesting to me because the character has the attitude of a sex worker, or maybe of some sort of mental health support worker with good boundaries, right? It's like, I unlove everyone as soon as this is over, but that runs so contrary to our ideas about love, and I think our cultural ideas about love are very much this idea of love is something that is sort of involuntary, and not something you can just turn on when someone sits in front of you. It was interesting to me to place it in that sort of professional context. And because it just, one of my favorite things to do in writing, and one of the things that I love about writing, is that you can just say something and it's true. But sometimes what you leave out is what makes something interesting. Like leaving out, well, what do you mean she sits across from people and loves them? And it's like, well, she just does, and then you just got to live with that and continue with the book, and you get glimpses of how she explains it, but she's not the most reliable of narrators, and she seems to have some assumption that people have some idea what she means when she says that, so you don't really get the full picture, and it's more interesting because you don't get the full picture to me. So
yeah, I think I like that a lot about writing too, that you just, some of the things you can like purposefully over explain, and then on the other hand you can just say, you can offer something like love, and then people have to, it colors the story based on the reader's definition of what that means. If they're willing to even like let their own definition be it, instead of trying to figure out what yours is the entire time.
Right. That's not to take too much of an aside, but it is related to the book somewhat. That's one of the things that I find really interesting about some of the very old Jewish texts that I read, or was reading when I was writing this book. It's like when you read something like the Talmud, they'll tell you a story, and it'll be an insane story. It'll just be, and it'll be a story that begs you to ask one question, like just like one of some pretty basic questions of like, well, why the fuck would somebody do that, or like these kind of things. And instead, and the Talmud has a built-in layer of like history to it, so it's got the Mishnah, and then there's the Gemara, and the Gemara is the rabbis who came after the Mishnah era, and they're asking questions about what they're reading in the Gemara.
Mm-hmm.
So you get the dialogue of the Mishnah era rabbis, and then you got the dialogue of the Gemara era rabbis about what they wrote about the Mishnah. So you'll get this insane story from the Tanaim, from the Mishnah era rabbis, and then the Gemara era rabbis, instead of asking the question that would be logical to ask, instead ask some really tiny little detail-oriented question that's mostly has to do with clarifying Jewish law.
Mm-hmm.
And so it'll be like, they could say, this isn't an exact example, but like, they'll talk about somebody like, they could say somebody is like walking around beating up bears with their spit, and they'll say then the questions that are asked are, well, what if the bears arrive on the Shabbos and you're spitting on the Shabbos, and instead of, how the fuck does somebody beat up bears with spit? Like, it's just never the obvious question, and it's like that type of giving too much detail in the wrong way and not enough in the right way, or the way a reader might want, is really interesting to me.
Yeah. And that's actually not too much of an aside, because I do remember reading maybe on Twitter or something a while back where you kind of talked about how this was like your Jewish book, and kind of in the same way that Sea Witch was your trans book, which we've discussed as kind of yes and kind of no. And as the more trans writers I talk to, we have kind of come to the conclusion that a trans book is like not the most helpful way of describing a book anyway. But in the last time we very briefly like touched on being Jewish, and since then I've become like a fan, I guess, of Jewish mysticism. Like, not a scholar, definitely not a practitioner, but like big fan. I think Merkava mysticism is really cool. Descending into the earth and having these like chambers and things. So I guess you kind of already touched on some of the reading you were doing, but like, how intentional was like were you doing the reading for the book, or just kind of like at the same time? And how have the two like influenced each other kind of in the after writing the book stage now?
So I started writing this book when I was about 1 year into the process of converting to Judaism. And so I was reading a ton of Jewish text very intentionally for that process, and just because as I was diving in, I was getting interested in going down all these rabbit holes. And so I was doing it just for myself, more or less, not necessarily intentionally for this book. But once I was there, I couldn't help but get ideas of ways I could expand this book in this direction. And I couldn't help but let that sort of infect this book. It was, I think, became very, very explicit for me. Like, I was playing with some of the sort of Kabbalistic sort of references in. So when I first wrote this, I wrote the third section first. So the section that's the almost like diary entry type stuff from the character who's like living in the room, Muriel Claudia. She that came first. That was the original part that I was writing, and I got to a point with that where I realized that this world needed to expand. There needed to be more to it, and that's when I started writing the coffee shop bit. And I had already started playing with some Jewish ideas in that third section, and and I was, oh yeah, then I added, about halfway through writing that, I added in the coffee shop character and was going back and forth. And then once I got to writing what is now the second section of the book, with the two children of the child of the rabbi and the child of the volcano king, that section is where it was inspired by, I had just been reading the tales of Rabbi Nachman, who was an 17th, 18th century Jewish mystic. He was the nephew of the founder of Hasidism. And I believe he was the nephew, maybe great nephew or something like that, but he was related in some way to the founder. He wrote these stories that were sort of supposed to be these mystical parables. And they are very long and very winding and deeply strange. And they make all kinds of logical leaps that are very counterintuitive. And especially reading them in translation in English, because they're originally written in Yiddish and Hebrew, they are, you get this like very strange sort of style of writing emerges, where there will be these parentheses, these long parentheticals that explain a word or a statement that repeat like all the time. Like you'll have like the fact that I have these two characters are referred to as children even into their like 30s and 40s, because there's no gender neutral word for, well, there's offspring, but that's generally not used in the singular, and it doesn't quite work. So like if you were translating from a language that had a gender neutral word for like son or daughter, then you could use that word to describe that character through the whole story. But it doesn't quite work, and it makes them sound like they're a child their whole life if you try to do it in English. So what I did is I did that, but then put long parentheticals after it every single time, because it evoked this style of translated writing that I was reading. And then these little subheads like bracket, like, and then it says a thing like the part where, you know, it'll say like the section where the two children journey into the mountain in search of the vomit bird or whatever, and like they're almost spoilers sometimes. And that was also a feature of these translations that I was reading, and so I was directly adopting the style of these, because these Rabbi Nachman stories were like, they were so stylistically and narratively bizarre, and elicited this like joyous reaction from me that only happens when I read some of my like favorite experimental writers. And I wanted to see if I basically wanted to just do a sort of tribute to Rabbi Nachman's writing style, especially as read in translation in that section, and to just see if I could make something that was like as batshit as what he wrote. And I don't think I quite did it. Like I think his is more batshit still, but it was so fun to do, and it was fun taking a big part of the way this narrative happened is I this is the first traditional novel I've written that wasn't written in like weird little chunks that then just sort of happen, and you sort of deal with them happening. I wanted it to flow like a novel flows, and in doing so, it ended up, I'm so ADHD, I can't sit down and write a narrative sort of front to back. And so what ended up happening was I wrote a couple narratives and found ways to stitch them together, that and to interweave them and sort of braid them together. And it led to this really strange structure that I ended up really liking. I think when I originally sat down to write this book, I had the thought that it might be more marketable than something like Sea Witch, and I don't think it is at all. Kind of because of that like really bizarre structure. But I thought maybe just the fact that they were paragraphs that led into paragraphs, and there weren't a bazillion pictures and scribbles and these kind of things, might make it more adaptable or something. But it at least led to something that I'm really happy with how it came out, and that ultimately is like what my goal for anything I make is.
Yeah, definitely. It's weird to open a book by an author you know and be shocked at how normal it looks.
Yeah.
Like I think that's a very like unique position I get to be in, where I'm like, wait a minute, what? There's no pictures. there's no lines everywhere. It's just words. Yeah. All right, well, but
I hope I made up for it by how insane the words are.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, you have a vomit bird, you have a Rainbear. Yeah. I like the parentheticals. I feel like they worked for me kind of in like, I guess, an unintentional way. Lately in Michigan, there's all like the dumb school board stuff with people trying to ban the book Genderqueer because I guess it has, children in it or whatever. And so like that almost, the parentheticals almost felt like a reaction to that, but like couldn't have been because, I'm reading it simultaneous to these things, but it's like just so everyone's cool, right? Like,
yeah,
they're not children. They're adults.
I mean, it was also a reaction to that in the sense of not necessarily directly that book, but I think the idea of queer and trans people as some sort of child molesters is one that is an age-old stereotype, and one that as someone who, I've been a children's librarian, I work with teens right now, like that follows me and that haunts me and that I am on guard about constantly. There have been points in my life, especially early transition, where I was terrified to be in any space where that children were in, for fear that someone would accuse me of existing in that space in a way that was somehow predatory, and I think that, in online spaces, there are, constantly accusations of trans people and queer people being predators, both from the right and from people who are supposedly like not on the right, people who are supposedly progressives, like still like throwing these things out. And I think that is frequently coming from stereotype and coming from this fear we have of queerness and transness, and particular types of queerness and transness as being predatory. And I think that is something that is, it's a big fear of mine. It's something that and so that playing for laughs, that kind of like like hyper defensiveness of my own was something that I was doing very intentionally, and also like knowing that there would be I'd get a chuckle out of some trans women who read it and knew exactly the feeling I was talking about. And also like it's cool that people who aren't trans women can also like, you know, have these reference points, because it's, you know, it's front page news now these days, you know, with the book bans and the, you know, the accusations of grooming and all this stuff from literally any time like any queer people exist. um it's you know, which the same thing happened in the 90s when in the 80s and 90s when gay people were coming out and also existing as teachers or as whatever, you know. It's just the same old shit over again. um and so yeah, I uh you picked up correctly
Yeah.
on that.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back like all the way, doesn't it? Like I was talking to my wife this morning about blood libel and how it's like it's the same thing, right? So the Jews are taking the Christian children and doing terrible things to them.
If you hate a group enough, think of the children is always a useful refrain in getting others to hate them as well.
Yeah. Too bad nobody actually thinks about children.
Oh no, none of this actually improves children's lives in any way whatsoever.
No.
And yeah. It's children are just a something to rest your rifle on while you take aim at something else.
Yeah. The thing I think we kind of talked about it with Sea Witch too, and I don't know, maybe it's just kind of like the imagery like that you use in your writing, the fact that like I don't know, Vomit Bird and Rainbear and things that are so silly. Like I always kind of walk away from your writing feeling like it's so much more joyful than maybe it is. Like again, I feel like we talked about this when we talked about Sea Witch, where I was like, man, it's like super cozy and everybody's having a good time. And you're like, yeah, but you know, there's other stuff in there too. And I don't know, like, do you think that's like an intentional thing on your part, or is that just sort of like your aesthetic leaking into your writing and just, you know, kind of rebounding off?
Oh, it's very intentional. I think there's writing, I mean, creative work in general, I think comes from a like space of play for me. And I think that experimental art is like begs to be a play space. A lot of my favorite creators are ones who create very playfully. And I think that I also think it's really interesting to mash something humorous next to something upsetting. It creates strong reactions.
Right.
And it can serve to, the humor can serve as a relief to let you go deeper and darker, and still have readers follow you there, and not put it down and sort of tap out. And it can also be something to make an upsetting thing more upsetting because it's followed by a moment of humor or some type of play. I think humor is interesting. Since since I was 11 years old, my favorite band has been They Might Be Giants, and I think a lot of people who have not engaged maybe as deeply as with their lyrics and their discography as I have, which I guess is pretty deep considering they've been my favorite band since I was 11 years old, and I'm turning 38 this week. Is that they so many of their songs are about mortality and death and just some real fucked up dark shit. And yet they have constantly gotten sort of like slotted in this category of like novelty music, which is interesting to me. And I don't even necessarily think it's wrong. I think it's wrong to dismiss them, because if they're making novelty music, they are making really interesting novelty music, deeply interesting novelty music. I think it's, you know, they use humor and play, and while doing so, talk about some really dark things. And I think that is something that has been interesting for me for a long time, is that idea of using humor and play to talk about very dark things, and to, I don't know, the Coen brothers do this also. You know, it's one of my favorite ways to engage. It's it's an acid trip that shifts so fast that you don't even realize it's shifted until you've gone real deep into some shit and you're like, oh no, I'm here now.